You know, playing retro games all the time is fun, but you gotta take some time every now and then for a lunch break. I'll review something here for you all in a little bit, but I just had this pizza delivered, so give me a second. I promise I'll eat fast. This is not pepperoni and black olives. What can you say about Spider-Man that hasn't been said already? He's one of the most popular comic book superheroes of all time, and arguably the most popular character to ever come out of Marvel Comics. We're getting to the point now where there have been so many incarnations of the character in film alone, it can be hard to keep track to all but the most dedicated comic fans. Despite this, chances are your favorite Spider-Man is going to be the one you grew up with. It was the Raimi trilogy for me, with Spider-Man 2 being my personal favorite, but differing opinions are part of what makes it so fun to discuss the various Spider-Man adaptations. And if you want to talk about differing opinions, then look no further than the massive catalog of Spider-Man video games. Nowadays, we have games like Insomniac Games' Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales, but back in the 90s the character was just as popular, and even on 16-bit consoles alone, there was no shortage of Spider-Man games. You had games like Maximum Carnage, which was a fun but challenging beat-em-up that suffered from the lack of a two-player mode, the sequel, Separation Anxiety, which included two-player support, but was even more frustrating because of cheap enemy placement and lack of continues, and then the animated series game, which was better graphically, but a step back in pretty much every other way. The best of these games, though, could be found on the Sega CD. Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin had a version on the Genesis, but the CD version is really where it's at. Animated cutscenes, fluid controls, a difficulty that felt just right, and an absolutely rocking soundtrack are all factors that make this game my personal favorite 16-bit Spider-Man game. So as you can see in the mid-90s, there was a lot of competition to make the best Spider-Man video game, but whereas most of these games are still talked about, or at least fondly remembered, there's one Spider-Man game that hardly anybody ever seems to bring up. Spider-Man Web of Fire for the 32X. If you've seen my other videos, then you've definitely seen the 32X before, but I've only ever used it for Genesis games. That changes today. The 32X has a complicated history that I won't get too far into here, but in short it was a failed add-on for the Genesis that was originally meant to be its own console. The 32X suffered from a rushed development time in the impending launch of the Sega Saturn, and it was discontinued after less than 2 years on the market, with only around 40 games released. So yeah, this thing flopped hard. Most consumers skipped out on it and decided to wait for the Saturn instead. It doesn't help that it's kind of a nightmare to hook this thing up. It needs specific cables and its own power supply, so it's hard to have a 32X setup that actually looks organized. Despite its shortcomings, there were some decent games released for the 32X, and if you really dig deep into its small library, you can find some fun ones. Most of the games flooded bargain bins at stores, and by Christmas 1995, every single game for the system had already been released. Every game except for one. And that brings us back to Spider-Man Web of Fire. Yeah, this was the last game released for the 32X in any territory. It came out in March 1996, and I have to say, it's so weird to be holding a Genesis game that came out after I was born. Just barely, but still, that goes to show you how late of a release this was. Since the game came out so late, Sega only made a single production run of cartridges, and this is why Web of Fire is by far the most expensive 32X game to buy today. It definitely looks like the last game released for the system. They didn't even bother with the cartridge art, it just has a screenshot of gameplay on there instead. I don't even feel like I should be touching this, but no turning back now. Besides, I've got some time to kill while I wait for my new pizza to come in, and I'm something of a game reviewer myself, so let's see if this game is worth the price, and more importantly, if the 32X ended on a high note. Right away we see the studio responsible, Blue Sky Software. Yep, I'm talking about another one of their games. I guess you can call this the third video in my Blue Sky trilogy now. The title screen is actually very cool looking with some pre-rendered 3D sprite work as Spider-Man swings into the foreground, and it definitely lives up to the title because there's fire everywhere. The story is told through the front page of the Daily Bugle, and it turns out the main villain of the game is actually Hydra. The organization has constructed a massive laser grid above New York City, effectively holding the entire city hostage. This is the Web of Fire the title refers to, and you can see it in the sky in most of the levels. Hydra sets a ransom of $1 billion, but unfortunately for them, two heroes were trapped inside the barrier as well, Spider-Man and Daredevil. Daredevil has unfortunately been captured by the super villains, but don't worry, we're gonna rescue him soon enough. Let's jump into the first level here, and right away the game looks fine. I don't really see much that could be taking advantage of the 32X's capabilities. There's some extra shading on the character sprites, and a lot of the background elements do have that early pre-rendered 3D look to them, but this looks like something that could run on a stock Genesis without a lot of compromises. So we're running through New York City beating up Hydra agents, and the sound they make when you knock them out sounds familiar. Yeah, they reused Alan Grant's death scream. I now choose to believe that this game and Jurassic Park are in the same universe. Anyway, you've got to beat these guys up, but Spider-Man's moveset is not so amazing. You have a standard 3-punch combo, a jump kick, a ducking punch, and your web. That's about it, and this is comic-accurate Spider-Man, so you have a limited supply of web to worry about. Thankfully, you can find more health and web fluids scattered around the levels, and it took me forever to realize that you can break certain things to get more items as well. About 1 minute into the stage, we find Daredevil, imprisoned in what looks like a birdcage on this random rooftop. Once I free him here, the cage explodes for some reason, and he majestically flips away through the air, leaving behind these Daredevil tokens. Yeah, for all of you who were hoping for a cool 2-player mode with Spider-Man and Daredevil, that's not the case here. Daredevil is a glorified screen nuke in this game. As long as you have Daredevil tokens in your inventory, you can pause the game and select Daredevil, where he'll then swing across the screen and deal a large amount of damage to everything. Having Daredevil just be a screen nuke is a huge missed opportunity. Even if they wanted to keep the game single player only, it still would have been cool to be able to switch between Spider-Man and Daredevil. Sadly, that's not the case, and the fact that the Daredevil option is in the pause menu means I frequently forget I can even use him. Why they didn't just map this to a button is beyond me. The 6-button controller had been out for years at this point, and this game only uses 3 buttons anyway. You can't rely on Daredevil all the time since he has limited uses, so you're gonna have to defend yourself, but combat in Web of Fire is frustrating. Enemies don't really get stunned when you hit them, so they can punch you and break your combo pretty easily. The best way I found to deal with them is to tie them up with webs first, then step in for the 3-punch combo. This doesn't always work though, especially not when multiple enemies are nearby. Even if you get them all on one side, they all bunch together and take off a ton of your health. It's best to try to hit them with the jump kick. While you're running around the city, parts of the buildings are falling apart thanks to the laser web high above, which means there's falling debris everywhere. You can be exploring the level, minding your own business, when suddenly you just get bonked on the head by a piece of a building. I just like to swing over everything, but this is one of my biggest complaints with the level design here. There's no way to tell what's below you, and I don't want to drop down and risk losing a life, so I just keep going. For all I know, I'm missing some useful items down there. Eventually, you'll get to the end of the level and the boss fight with Dragon Man, the first of the enforcers who are invading the city. The sprite work on Dragon Man is actually impressive. He looks pretty cool, but despite his size, the fight is nothing special. Shoot him with web, step in with the 3-punch combo, and step back before he can hit you. Just repeat that until you punch his head off like the android woman in Jason X. Once you beat him, you have to destroy the first generator, and then it's off to the power plant. I'll just say right now, this is my least favorite level in the whole game. It feels like a maze, and it just keeps going, even when you feel like you're getting close to the end. The timing to avoid the electric currents is pretty strict, and these drone-looking things just keep coming after you. Being that you mostly encounter them on a wall, it can be really hard to hit them at the right time. A lot of this level feels like it's been copied and pasted. I swear I've been through here before, but nope, it's just areas that look the same. This is a recurring problem for the rest of the game. I'm having some trouble here with the wall climbing. Spider-Man will oftentimes stick to surfaces that you don't want him to, and getting him to let go can be a challenge. This led to a lot of unnecessary damage for me. Finally, you'll reach the generator and a boss fight with the eel. He's kind of a pain. He recovers quickly from your punches, so you can't keep hitting him for too long, and he has this annoying lightning projectile if you get too far away. This fight took me a couple tries, but I managed to make it through and destroy the next generator. Stage 3 takes place on the George Washington Bridge, and this might be my favorite level. Since we're on a bridge, there's not a lot of verticality here, and it's a pretty straight shot to the end. But a lack of verticality should not be a positive in a Spider-Man game. Half the fun of playing as Spider-Man comes from scaling buildings and getting higher off the ground, but here I'm just moving to the right. Even Maximum Carnage, for all its problems, understood the fun of climbing skyscrapers. You can break streetlights and payphones in this stage to get more items, and there are secret ledges high up with health on them, but they're a pain to get to. You're supposed to web swing back and forth while gradually gaining height, but I couldn't get the timing right. It's kinda tricky. It doesn't help that you have these new enemies that look like fish that shoot lasers, and you have barely any time to get out of the way of their shots. Eventually, you'll make it across the bridge where... It's confirmed. Vector Man and Spider-Man take place in the same universe. Okay, I know the background isn't exactly the same, but the similarities are obvious. Vector Man 2 did come out about 8 months after this game, so it probably shared some development staff. This pipe station area makes up the second half of Stage 3. There's fire that you have to avoid, and doing so is easier said than done. I try to stick to the ceiling wherever I can, but there are enemies up there who will knock you back down before you can even process what just happened. Thankfully, this section isn't very long, and before you know it, you'll be fighting Thermite. He has the ability to shoot fire at you, but thankfully you should be stocked up on web fluid at this point, so you can just web him up repeatedly and keep punching him. He goes down pretty easily after this. With the third generator destroyed, Hydra's plans are effectively ruined, but the game isn't over. Hydra tries to make a run for it in their airship, but we're not having any of that, so it's time to take the fight to them. Now this looks more like what I'd expect from a Spider-Man game. Those first 3 levels were so dark and gloomy, but this is definitely more colorful and looks to be taking advantage of the 32X's larger color palette. The game keeps throwing these giant Hydra soldiers at you, and they take a ton of hits, but you're not required to defeat each one, so I just swung right over. You're just pushing through waves of these guys, and it gets monotonous really quick. So now I'm in what looks like a missile silo, and it's a maze to get to the top. There are these rotating platforms that can crush you and deal a ton of damage in the process, so take your time and jump carefully. These annoying cannons on the wall can mess up a lot of your jumps, so just cling to the wall under them and keep slapping them until they blow up. Once you get to the top, you'll have to face off with Tangle, who can also shoot webs at you. She's pretty easy, especially when compared to the eel, and when she goes down, you're approaching the final section of the game. This seems to be a missile or rocket storage area for Hydra, but despite that, there's not much going on here. The drone enemies from before are the only enemies in this area, so push your way through and you'll come to the final boss fight with the Super Adaptoid. This guy has the ability to transform himself into any of the bosses you've fought so far, so either remember every boss's fight pattern and counter accordingly, or just shoot them with some web and take a few punches before backing up. Seems to be the golden strategy with this game. With that said, he takes a lot of hits, so it's still easy to run out of web fluid during the fight, and you'll probably have to rely on Daredevil a couple times. What? I'm hungry. Finally, but the game still isn't over. Once the Super Adaptoid explodes, you have to escape the exploding Hydra ship before the timer runs out. Don't even worry about the enemies, just keep pushing your way through to reach the other side. The timer is not generous at all, so keep moving at all costs. Once you reach the other side, the ship explodes and that's it, you've beaten Web of Fire. I don't know how Spider-Man escaped the ship once he reached the other side, but I guess that's not important. Spider-Man celebrates his victory, and the credits roll. Yeah, not much of an ending there, but I'm not really surprised. Well, it took a lot of button mashing, but I finally did it. I made it through Web of Fire. It helps you can beat the game pretty quick. It hasn't even been a half hour. The game might be short, but make no mistake, it provides a good challenge. It's not always fair though, as the enemies frequently gang up on you, and the level design is either really flat or just plain confusing. There's no in between. One thing I've neglected to mention up to this point is the game's soundtrack, and that's because it's probably the most infamous part of this game. The music makes a terrible first impression with the first level theme, consisting mostly of the Genesis sound chips screaming in pain. If your ears can power through that one though, the rest of the music tracks do slowly get better. Now I'm not saying that the music is amazing or anything, but the later stage themes are fine and they fit with the gameplay. This is background music through and through, and not something I'd say is worth listening to outside of the game, so just don't turn your speakers up too loud and you'll be fine. My biggest complaint with the game is just how repetitive it feels. You have to repeat the same 3-punch combo so many times and it gets boring real fast. Not to mention the number of times I almost turned the console off while trying to find a way through the power plant stage. You've probably noticed it by now, but the game also suffers from slowdown when too many enemies are on screen, or even just when you're fighting a boss. Dragon Man in particular causes the game to chug, and by the time you finish the first stage, you've basically seen everything the game has to offer gameplay-wise. This could have been an excellent Spider-Man game, taking advantage of the 32X's expanded color palette and extra horsepower to deliver the best Spider-Man game up to that point. Instead, we ended up with another generic side-scrolling beat-em-up that can't even hold a candle to separation anxiety. Is Web of Fire a terrible game? No, it's a perfectly playable Spider-Man game from beginning to end, but it's mediocre at best. I don't care how much money you have, do not spend $1,000 on this game, it's not worth it. You can get a better Spider-Man game for a fraction of that price. I can't say it enough, if you're looking for the best Spider-Man game on 16-bit hardware, play Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin on Sega CD. The cutscenes are pretty cheesy, but the gameplay more than makes up for it, and it's worth it for the soundtrack alone. This Web of Fire didn't burn too bright after all. It's kind of a shame that the 32X didn't go out with a bang, but if you know anything about its history, the platform never really had a chance to begin with. Web of Fire isn't good by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're a Spider-Man fan, I'd still say it's an interesting curiosity that you might want to play. Just don't spend the money on a physical copy. Even on the 32X you can find much better games. There's one good thing though, my pizza should be here any minute now. Thank you all for joining me for this episode of Retro Rampage, and you can keep it here on Rampaging Rex Productions for more retro gaming videos coming your way soon. Ooh, perfect timing. Hey, I'll see you all next time. I'm starving. I'm getting sick of these to-go meals. This doesn't even work.